When deciding what switch axe to craft, there are two things you have to consider. Its stats, of course, and most importantly, what phial type it has. So, in this video, I'll be rating all the switch axes in mhnow, and I'll be giving you guys my recommendations for each element, raw, and status. But first, we have to understand the switch axe's phial system. There are actually 5 phial types in mhnow. Power phials, power element phials, and 3 status phials. Only power phials and power element phials buff your weapon's damage, and unfortunately these two phials are not made equally. Cause with the way mhnow is designed and how damage is calculated in the game, element is currently the meta. And if we check on paper, power element phials provide a 25% elemental attack buff to your sword attacks, while power phials only give a 15% buff to your raw attack power. And if we take into consideration armor skills, the current meta is the crit element skill. It provides a huge buff to your elemental damage, plus it stacks with your element switch axe phials. While for power phials, there's just no other skill for raw attack power that can match the buffs you get for crit element. Critical ferocity may be the closest option we have currently in the game for raw weapons, but sadly I don't think the skill is even worth it. It increases your negative affinity for a small chance for big damage. And what I hate the most is no matter how much critical ferocity skills you have, you will always have only a small chance to get that big damage. Now what usually happens in my experience with this skill is that at critical ferocity 3, for every 3 to 5 negative affinity debuffs you get, you only get 1 critical ferocity buff. So I feel like the extra damage you get only balances out the negative debuffs you get. But I guess for fast attacking weapons you do have more chances to proc this small chance to get that critical ferocity buff. I still don't think it's worth it for increasing your negative affinity. Critical ferocity still can't match up the consistent damage you get from crit element. And with this in mind, power element phials is the way to go. That's why for fire element switch axes, the best choice is clearly the silver Rathalos switch axe. Among the Rathalos switch axes, it's the only one with power element phials. The regular Rathalos and the azure Rathalos switch axe have power phials. The silver Rathalos switch axe on the other hand has good stats, high affinity, and most of all, 2 points of critical element, making it the best fire elemental switch axe. The Anjanet switch axe also has power element phials, but it has a very low elemental attack power. So that buff you'll be getting from the elemental phials will be limited. So I wouldn't suggest crafting the Anjanet switch axe. For water elemental switch axes, I had a hard time picking a clear winner. It came down to the Coral Puke switch axe and the Mizutsune switch axe. One has power element phials and the other has power phials. Both are solid picks for a water elemental switch axe, but I think the Mizutsune switch axe falls short just because it has power phials. Given that it has positive affinity, its raw attack power is lowered, so the buff you get from power phials will also be lowered. Also, in my opinion, the best Mizutsune weapon to craft is the dual blades, and I already invested my materials on that weapon, so my pick for the best water elemental switch axe will be the Coral Puke switch axe. Overall, good stats and the power element phials it has just makes it even better. Now, the Jura switch axe also has power element phials, but it falls short in terms of stats. The Jagras switch axe, on the other hand, is an interesting one. It's the only switch axe that can knock out monsters since it has exhaust phials. It's clearly not the best, but I'm sure it's gonna be fun to mess around with. For the Thunder element, my pick will be the Zinogre switch axe. It's a fantastic switch axe to pair with crit element builds with its solid stats and buffs that stack with power element phials. The Rajang switch axe is another solid pick. Even though it has power phials, if you consider that it has a very high raw attack power, then that phial buff will be very huge as well. But the main challenge will be playing around with its negative affinity. It has 1 point of fighting spirit, so making a full fighting spirit build with a critical ferocity mix to take advantage of its negative affinity will be an interesting build to try. It's not going to be as consistent as the critical element build since both fighting spirit and critical ferocity are very situational skills. I'm still trying to refine this build, so if you have any suggestions for this Rajang Switch Axe build, leave them in the comments below. For the Toby Switch Axe, it does have power phials, so it's not as good. And the Kezu Switch Axe does have power element phials in high affinity, but it has a low element attack power. So I don't think it can compare to the Zinogre Switch Axe. Now moving on to ice weapons. The Kushala Switch Axe is honestly not a bad option. It may have power phials, but that chunky raw attack power makes up for that damage. Combine it with Hunter's Unity and Kushala Frostwind, and you're in for some big damage. But Kushala is notoriously hard to farm, so another great option you have is the Legiana Switch Axe with good stats and power element phials. For Dragon Switch Axes, we only have 2 options. The Deviljho Switch Axe and the Nergigante Switch Axe. Both honestly very hard to farm, so for this one, your choice will ultimately depend on what build you want to use. The Nergigante Switch Axe is the better choice for critical element builds given that it has no negative affinity, but the Deviljho Switch Axe does have Morph Boost. Pair it with Nergigante Avidity and Morph Boost pieces, and honestly you have a pretty solid build with some Amazon warrior vibes going on. That's all the elements, so now we move on to raw switch axes. The only switch axes worth considering in this category is the Black Diablo Switch Axe and the new Tigrex Switch Axe. Both have very high raw and also very high negative affinity, and most of all, power phials. The Black Diablo Switch Axe does have the higher raw stat just by a little bit, but the Tigrex Switch Axe has a more damage-oriented skill with critical ferocity. I think the Tigrex Switch Axe can output more damage than the Black Diablo Switch Axe, but you have to invest on it and unlock its critical ferocity skill at grade 8. It's basically gonna be weaker than the Black Diablo Switch Axe until you unlock its critical ferocity skill, and honestly, I don't think it's worth it. I'd rather have a Black Diablo's weapon with Part Breaker for farming builds than a Tigrex weapon whose damage is only gonna fall short when compared to the elemental meta sets. But that's just my opinion. So, that covers all the elements and the raw switch axe options. Now let's talk about status switch axes. Status switch axes, in my opinion, are great if they have power element status phials, because with these things you can buff your status buildup by 25% when in sword mode. They don't buff any damage, but they do allow you to build up special status ailments on the monster much faster. The Goldrathian Switch Axe with Poison Exploit is something worth considering. It can inflict poison more consistently than the Goldrathian Gunlance since you don't have to rely on worm stakes to poison the monster. Just swing your sword and take advantage of its power element phials. But in terms of burst damage using Poison Exploit, I still think nothing can beat the Goldrathian Gunlance. For Blast, we do have 2 options, the Teostra Switch Axe and the Magnamalo Switch Axe. Both have power phials, and the Teostra one does have the higher stats, but the Magnamalo Switch Axe does have Part Breaker. Utility-wise, I'd go for the Magnamalo Switch Axe because it's a great alternative to the Black Diablo Switch Axe in Part Breaker builds. For sleep, our only option is the Nightshade Switch Axe, and it's not worth it. It's not just because it has power phials, but it's mainly because the Switch Axe doesn't have any good wake-up options to take advantage of the Rude Awakener skill. For Paralysis, the Volvidon Switch Axe is the MVP. It has the higher paralysis stat compared to the Jiro's weapons, plus it has power element phials, further buffing its paralysis buildup. But for this weapon, I would consider equipping some power prolonger skills so that you can use more sword attacks and build up more paralysis on the monster. And that covers all my switch axe recommendations. In this video, I showed you guys some builds that I'm testing. I'm not just done testing them just yet, but if you want a meta build for the switch axe, you can check out this video next. You can use the exact same build for the switch axe and get some big damage. But that's it for this one. I'll see you guys in the next one.